Okay, Chris, I think we're ready to go. So, folks, welcome to the March meeting of the Ottawa Centre, RASC, and a special welcome to other RASC centres and visitors who are here with us this evening. A couple of security things when we're in the Zoom platform here. We will not be monitoring the chat box during the meeting. You're welcome to chat among yourselves. Please use the Q&A button for questions. Do not raise your hand. The Q&A is the best way to get our attention. For your security, do not click on any web links that might appear in the chat or Q&A windows. Sometimes people put nefarious links in there, and we'd hate for you to go to a bad website. Okay, next slide, please. So here is tonight's program. We're just going through the introduction right now. I'll be doing the Ottawa skies for March. Jim Thompson's going to be talking about building a micro observatory. I'll have a break with our normal M&M challenge for about 5 minutes. We'll have observations and announcements at the end. Tonight's meeting, I think, might be a little shorter than we have been in the past. We'll be ending at a normal time, about 9:30 thereabouts, hopefully. Okay. So welcome to our new members and the new members in 2021. Members in the news. The soothing effects of stargazing. And yeah, we have Gary Boyle there, who was on ABC. And congratulations for that, Gary. So Ottawa skies for March. In terms of planetary stuff, it's pretty boring this month. We'll get into that. First of all, let's take a look at the moon phases. So there we are. We just came off of a new moon at the end of the last month, and moving towards a new moon on the 13th and another new moon on the 28th. We have daylight saving time starting on the 14th, which means that we have to stay up later to see our dark skies. So there are two comets that are up there right now. Both of them are pretty faint. We've got comet 141P, Mashalaw's 2, and there's where it is up in the skies right now. You can see in a couple of days it's going to be moving right through the middle of Orion. And then 29P, Schwarzmann-Walkman, January to early March, we're going to be able to see it. And then it will be returning at dawn in mid-July. So there's the pattern across the sky there. Sunrise and set, days are obviously getting longer. And of course, with the adjustment to daylight savings time, there's a huge jump in the sunset time. Mercury, March the 6th, that's tomorrow, greatest western elongation. Look for the planet in the eastern sky just before sunrise. So it's a good time to observe Mercury without the sun in your way. Venus is not visible. It's rising and setting with the sun, as are a bunch of other planets. Mars is visible in the evening, and it's going to be visible all month. Jupiter is rising and setting with the sun. And Saturn is rising and setting with the sun, but it will be visible just before sunrise later, the later half of the month. But yeah, it's pretty bleak when it comes to planet observing. Next one. Uranus is visible all evening, and Neptune is not visible. It's also rising and setting with the sun. And there is our cartoon of the month. So a pretty good nova. There we go. Okay, I'm still doing virtual interactive introduction to astronomy. And this is, you can just contact me, meetingchair@ottawa.rasc.ca. I typically do it for scouts and guides. I've also done it for adult groups as well. And the younger kids, Beavers and Sparks, which are 5 to 7-year-olds, it's about 45 minutes. The Cubs, Scouts, Guides, Pathfinders, and so on, it's about an hour and 15 minutes. And for the Scouts, it covers the requirements for their Scout space badges. And I'm actually presenting both programs with the Ottawa Public Library towards the end of this month. So if you have some kids at home who want to see them, they're not part of Scouts and Guides, check the Ottawa Public Library website. It's around the 25th, I'm doing this off the top of my head, around the 25th of March. For the younger kids, it'll be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And for the older kids and adults, it's in the evening. Okay. And then for those who've seen the first presentation, I have a follow-up presentation that I do. It goes into a little bit more detail about the moon, the sun, exoplanets, SETI, stellarium. We also do messing with Messier. So we'll go through a lot of the Messier objects. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jim Thompson, who's going to talk about building a micro observatory. So Chris, you can stop your sharing, then Jim's going to share his. There we go.
All right, thank you, Dave. Everybody can see the display all right, I hope. So good evening, everyone. I hope you've been having an opportunity to get out the last few months to enjoy some fine winter observing. Hasn't been that great this past month, but maybe you've squeaked out some time outside. In the same vein as the presentation we had back in December by Brian McCullough about his decommissioning of his Bright Star Observatory, tonight I will take everyone through the planning and construction of my own small backyard observatory. My presentation will cover why I built it, where I built it, and how I built it, as well as what worked with the design and what didn't. Before I built my observatory, I used to set up my telescope every time I wanted to observe. When I was done, I'd pack it all up and bring it back inside. This image here is of the 8-inch LX10 I was using back in 2009, set up for a night of visual observing from my backyard. Note the pile of filters I was experimenting with even back then. By 2011, I had made the transition to electronically assisted astronomy, or EAA, as well as to a German equatorial mount. The image on the right illustrates a typical setup for an evening of observing. My main EAA camera at the time was a Mallancam Extreme, shown here mounted on the 8-inch SCT. You will note the multitude of cables involved back then. It's quite a mess of them there on the ground. So why did I build a micro observatory? Well, one of the biggest reasons was that having a full-time job and 2 kids means I don't have a lot of spare time to observe. Having so little free time means that it is not practical for me to drive an hour to find dark skies. Pretty much all of my observing happens from my backyard. As you might imagine from the preceding slide, setting up to do EAA can be time-consuming. Carrying everything outside, assembling it, and getting the mount balanced and aligned can easily take 45 minutes or more. And then the same again at the end of the night to pack it all up. The final thing to consider was the available space in my yard. My family has many other uses of our backyard, so whatever I was to build had to be small. This is an image captured from Google Maps showing the area around my house in central Ottawa. As you can see, my neighborhood has a lot of tall, mature trees. My driveway and front yard are totally useless for observing as a result. The backyards in my neighborhood are all on the order of 50 by 50 feet in size. You can see that I already have a patio, 2 sheds, and a vegetable garden in my yard. So a traditional dome-style observatory was likely going to be too big to acquire the necessary family approvals. At least there aren't too many large trees in the area around my backyard. After giving it some serious thought and some trial and error with my tripod-mounted setup, I decided to put my observatory in the northwest corner of the yard as indicated by the X in the image on the right. The view of the sky from this position is good towards the south and east, but totally blocked by houses and trees to the north and west. This position also minimizes direct exposure to porch lights from my neighbors. From this position, I can still see Polaris, but just barely, over the neighbor's oak tree, allowing me to do my polar alignments. Finally, this position is tucked in nicely next to the existing patio, so very little of the yard is affected. So, how did I plan to build an observatory with a very small footprint? Well, the sketch here on the left gives a rudimentary idea of what I planned. To give me as small a footprint as possible, yet still provide a stable support for the telescope, I decided to use a 10-inch reinforced concrete pier with a work table cantilevered off of it. All of the materials were readily available from Home Depot, including the sonotube, concrete mix, wire mesh, and gravel. I did all the work myself, except for the mount adapter, which you will see later. For various reasons, mostly the available time, the observatory was built in phases over the course of 6.5 years. So work started on July 19th, 2014, with the digging of a hole. Digging by hand was very slow, due to the ground consisting of hard-packed clay. After about 2 hours of steady digging, I decided that was far enough, ending with a hole about 2 feet across and 2 feet deep. The next step was to put a layer of drainage stone in the bottom of the hole. This is to keep water away from the base of the pier and hopefully reduce any tendency for it to get heaved by frost. Next, I formed the reinforcing wire mesh in the shape of a cylinder, complete with a mushroom-shaped base, and then put it into the hole. Using high-strength concrete, I put about 8 inches of concrete in the hole over the wire mesh, forming the base of the pier. The wire mesh was loosely supported and the whole thing covered for 24 hours while the concrete hardened. The next day, I put the sonotube into the hole over top of the wire mesh and backfilled around it, first with more of the drainage gravel and then with the dirt that I had taken out of the hole. I left the dirt a few inches shy of the top of the hole to leave room later for topsoil and sod. I plumbed the sonotube and added wooden braces on the outside to keep it perfectly upright. I also located and installed the 4 half-inch threaded rod that would eventually support the work table. I also made a wooden template to hold the 3/4-inch threaded rod that would eventually support the mount. With all this ready to go, I hand-mixed bag after bag of concrete and poured it into the sonotube until it was full. This was slow, laborious work and a little tricky as the concrete had to be transferred from my wheelbarrow into a bucket to be carried up a ladder and poured down the sonotube, 1 bucket at a time. After allowing the concrete a couple of days to cure, I removed the braces and trimmed the sonotube back to the final height. I primed and painted the exterior of the sonotube to preserve it a bit better from the weather. Then the project went on hiatus for 4 months due to various things going on at the time. When the work started up again in November, I laid out the work table using 2x4s, a bit of a jigsaw puzzle really, and got it installed on the pier complete with plywood top. It's held to the pier, as you can see, by the threaded rod that was pre-installed when I poured the concrete. The last step to get the pier operational, oops, sorry, I skipped a page. Next, the pressure was on to get all the wiring done before it snowed. This consisted of digging 2 shallow trenches between my house and the pier, one for the data cables and one for the AC power. I ran the power separately in order to minimize the potential for electrical interference on my data cables. The cables were all run inside of standard PVC electrical conduit, 1.25" diameter conduit for the data cables and 1/2" diameter conduit for the power. The final installation at the pier includes 2 GFCI receptacles, 2 USB-powered extension cables, 2 Cat6 Ethernet cables, 1 S-video, 1 composite video, and 1 9-pin serial cable. You can see from the photo that I finished just in time. The last step to get the pier operational was the mount adapter. I built a prototype out of wood first, and then had the machinist at my work make me one out of scrap aluminum we had laying around the shop. First light with the new pier was on December 7th, 2014. I used the pier in this configuration for about 5 years, using a poly tarp to cover it when not in use. Consequently, that poly tarp had to be replaced about once a year due to exposure to the elements wearing it out. Over this 5-year period, my venerable Atlas mount started to really show its age. So I finally decided in 2019 to upgrade my mount. To replace the Atlas, I purchased a Skywatcher EQ8R Pro. It is a beast of a mount, very solid, with 110-pound carrying capacity. Now I can put all my scopes on the mount at the same time, instead of having to swap them around like I used to do with my Atlas. I can now flip between observing the sun, the moon, or deep sky objects without swapping telescopes and having to rebalance the mount. Boy, is that sweet. Now we come to the past spring, 2020. With my mount and scope setup settled, it was time to stop procrastinating and put a permanent cover for the observatory. To keep with the small footprint theme, I decided to build a lightweight flip-down doghouse out of wood and aluminum. The steel roof and pressure-treated board that clads the outside matches the appearance of my 2 garden sheds, which were renovated around the same time. The matching exterior helps the observatory look less conspicuous. Finally, in June 2020, my micro observatory project was finished. There are a number of things that I think went well with this project. First off, having a permanently mounted, balanced, and aligned German equatorial mount makes life so much easier. Tracking and go-to accuracy are all issues I no longer have to deal with. Since my telescopes stay outside now, they are already at ambient or near ambient temperature when I open up the observatory, so practically no cool down time is needed before observing. The doghouse idea, although it looks kind of ugly, works very well. Way easier than slinging a heavy tarp on and off all the time. The well-ventilated doghouse also keeps the mount and scopes from getting too hot in the summer. Finally, perhaps the biggest benefit of the observatory is that my setup time has been greatly reduced. I can open the doghouse, hook up my laptop, cameras, power it all on, do a 1-star mount alignment, focus, and be ready to observe, all in 5 to 10 minutes. Things that I would do differently a second time include renting a post hole digger so that it would have taken less time and allowed me to dig a deeper hole. Renting an electric mixer would have been a lot easier also, as hand mixing took a lot of time and was laborious, and I in fact went through 3 of the Home Depot buckets, and I cracked my wheelbarrow all as part of this exercise. I should have moved to the more permanent mount cover sooner, I think. I pushed my luck using just a poly tarp. Incomplete weatherproofing may have been part of the reason why my Atlas mount started to act up. I did try using wireless communications at the time I first built the Pier, but I found it unreliable in the cold weather. However, wireless technology is probably much better now, so it would probably be worth another look. And finally, my calculations with the doghouse design were off a bit, resulting in a small obstruction of my field of view when looking south. A minor issue, really, but I may have been able to avoid it if I had prototyped the doghouse before building the final version. In conclusion, the whole project was very affordable. Materials for the Pier totaled around $200. Purchase of the 50 feet of the various cables that I ran between the mount and my basement computer came to around $200. And the materials to build the doghouse came to around $300. So the total cost of the observatory came to around $700. Coincidentally, I spent almost as much on tarps over the course of 5 years as I did to build the doghouse. I am very happy with the final result of my observatory build. It is so quick to set up and take down now. I have no problem opening the observatory up for even 15 to 20-minute observing sessions. So, take that, clouds. Thank you for listening. If anyone has a question, I would be happy to answer it.
Yes, Jim, we have a few questions here. First one's from Hugo. He says, this is very interesting, as I've long thought about putting in a more permanent mount. Did you consider sinking a solid steel H-beam into the concrete base instead of forming a concrete post? Are there any technical considerations between steel versus concrete, thermal expansion, and so on? And the advantage of using concrete, I think, is cost versus steel, but attaching the alliday platform might be more difficult when working with concrete.
Yeah, at the end of the day, there still needs to be some physical interface between the mount and the top of the pier. So I don't think there was really anything to be saved or gained by going to concrete or metal in that regard. But my choice to use concrete was really a cost and an ease of installing it myself. If I went with a large I-beam, which I know a lot of other people do, I wouldn't get away from having to put something in the ground. And I would have the added cost of having to get somebody to weld me up an I-beam with mounting plates on either end. So really, it was the most economical way to do it and the easiest way to do it, in my opinion.
Okay, from Paul Sadler. Did you consider a roll-off telephone booth outhouse design rather than a flip? And do you have any problems with bugs or animals?
So the first question, yes, I did consider a roll-off. My My concern was that it did affect the footprint. Like I would have to have something on the ground for the doghouse to roll on. It would also increase the size and weight of the doghouse. And it was hard to get a good seal around the base if it had wheels that it would roll on. So I thought about it, but it was adding a little bit too much to the complexity to have it a rollaway thing. It's not really clear from the picture in regards to the animals and bugs, but all of the cracks that exist around the base of the table have all been sealed up using the expanding spray foam. And similarly, any of the cracks in the doghouse have been sealed up. The only openings that exist are covered with screens. So all the vent holes are screen covered. So I do have spiders, but other than that, I haven't had any issues with other types of bugs or squirrels or anything like that.
Okay. From Chris, he says, does the attached work table and doghouse impart vibration into the pier and telescope?
No, it is surprisingly solid, actually. I'm quite impressed with how it turned out. There's so much mass in that pier that any smacking on the table gets dampened like right away. So I've never seen any issue with that. There's more vibration induced by the wind on the telescopes than there is from working on the work table.
Okay. Gordon Dewey has said, did you include any extra lines to pull future cables out to your pier?
Well, that's why I had two Cat 6 cables. That was kind of making it future-proof. And the two USB, one was a USB 2 and one was a USB 3. So the USB 3 was put in fairly early on in USB 3 use. So that future-proofed it a little bit, but indeed, if something goes wrong, like one of the extension cables fails, it will be a real hassle to replace it. I can't easily pull new cables through because of the U-shaped path that the conduit takes.
Okay. Somebody's asking, do you worry about theft of the scope when nobody's around?
I do. It's not obvious, but it is padlocked closed. So when the doghouse is flipped up, it's locked into place. So you would have to break into it to get into it. So it's in that regard not much different than if I built a full up observatory.
Sure. Any issues with equipment left in minus 20-degree weather?
Not so far, no. I've this mount I've only had for just over a year, and I haven't used it that much. Maybe only a dozen times over the course of this winter. I haven't had any issues with it. But the Atlas mount, even the old used Atlas I used to use it down to minus 20, minus 25, and it never had any issues at all. The only thing I had to keep an eye on was how the cables are routed. So they have to be left with lots of loose loops and routed up along the rotational axis of the mount so they don't actually have to move very much. Otherwise, like the Ethernet cables, they will crack very easily in the cold, and all the other cables get very, very stiff, and they can pull on your scope if you don't have them properly strain relieved and lots of slack in them. But yeah, I haven't really had too much issue.
Okay, one person is asking, you mentioned a 6-year time frame. Do you have an estimate of how many hours was into this build?
That's a good question. Actually, I never did work that out. It's probably like to build the pier itself was probably on the order of 40 hours. And then the doghouse was maybe 20 hours. So in the order of 60 hours-ish.
Okay. Somebody suggested you could add a wireless alarm sensor at some point if you needed to for theft. Taras was asking, has there been any drift in your polar alignment since the ground settled?
A little tiny bit. And I don't know if it's entirely because of it settling, because when I bounce this configuration you see here with the 3 scopes, that's kind of where everything is at right now. But I have been changing things on and off, and whenever I do a balance, I actually climb up and stand on that platform. So all my weight is on that platform, and I basically hug the whole mount and do all of the shifting of the telescopes around. So you would think with my weight walking around up there that things would move around, and it drifted like you just touched one of the adjustment screws and you're back in. So it was very, very small amount of drift. It's very, very solid. I'm happy, because I was worried only going 4 feet into the ground that I would get some heave, but I think the drainage stone made the difference. So I haven't had any issues.
Okay. Emily's asking, what do you think of sky pods? Did you look at those?
I did not, because of my desire to take up as little space as I could. I didn't even really look at them. I know a couple of people in the Ottawa area, like in RASC group and in the OAOG, have them, and they have been very happy with them. I didn't really see a need to have an enclosure that I could sit inside of, because all of my observing is remote. Like very rarely am I actually out there for the night by the scope. I'm usually inside the house. There wasn't any need for there to be a place for me to sit down and get out of the weather myself. So the SkyPod didn't really give me anything that I was looking for.
Okay. What about light pollution in your neighborhood?
Yeah, it's bad. So like I mentioned earlier, the mount is strategically placed. So my house blocks my one neighbor's porch light, and the shed in one corner blocks the other neighbor's porch light. So there's like this little nexus of shadow in my backyard, and that's where the mount is placed. So I don't really have any direct local light where the mount is, but of course, being in the middle of Ottawa, there's lots of light pollution.
Okay. Paul Sadler says he would like one. And then, just kidding. Do you do much visual observing, or mostly entirely imaging? Can you do visual? I mean, get close enough to do that.
Yeah, you can get close enough, because the swing arm on the mount is so wide. When you're tracking an object, the telescope is hanging over away from the table, so you can definitely do visual. I have done a little bit, like when I want to look at the moon or the planets, I will, but almost entirely all my observing is done with electronically assisted astronomy.
Okay. Doug Fleming told Paul to get in line. Okay. Douglas O'Brien asked, what is the software configuration to drive the scopes and the cameras?
So I drive the two separately. So when I set up, I put a laptop at the mount, and the laptop drives the mount through Stellarium, through EQ mod plugin for Stellarium, and that works very well. When I'm in the house, I just remotely log into the laptop over my household network and run it remotely from there. The cameras, they all run USB all the way into the house. My older cameras that were video, they would have been also S-video or composite all the way 50 feet into the computer that I'm sitting at right now in the basement. So my local computer runs the cameras, and the remote computer runs the mount. And I find that works pretty well. It splits the loading up between two machines.
Okay. And you're running Windows or Mac?
It's Windows, yeah.
Windows, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions, unless there's any more. If there are, please just type in the Q&A window. Fascinating presentation, Jim.
All right, thank you.
That's a great idea. Okay. So Chris is going to start his share here in a second. There we go. So we're moving ahead. We've got a bunch of observations after the break, but we are going to take a 5-minute break. And over the break, we have a Messier and Moon challenge. So here are the objects. See if you can guess what they are. The answer will be in 5 minutes. Next slide, please, Chris. There we go. Okay, about a minute left before we get started again.
Hey, Dave, I'm going to leave my video off just to conserve the bandwidth there. So feel free to use that picture.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep, no problem.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Okay, Chris, if you can move to the next slide. Okay, so here's the answer to the M&M challenge. So we have M33, Pinwheel Galaxy, and Gassendi as the moon crater. So I know at least one of you got that right. They flipped an answer to us. Just to remind you folks that if you have questions for anybody who's doing a presentation, please do not use the chat box. Please use the Q&A. It's very difficult to monitor the chat box because lots of things are going on there. So just type in the Q&A. So moving on to the next slide, we have observations tonight from Bob Olson, Andrea, Taras, and Paul and Jim are doing a neat thing together. So we're going to start with Bob Olson. Just give me a second here. I'm going to highlight you, Bob.
Okay. I usually winter down south, so I get fooled by the problems of winter weather observing. I am aware of frost on the scope and frost on the observer, shoveling off the observatory pad platform that I image on, and cold proofing the cables. Next slide. But I got fooled by this. My observing platform, my telescope, is set up on the southern edge of my property, and this open field has been taken over in the winter by snowmobilers, and they absolutely love nighttime rides. I have to be honest. These guys are my friends and neighbors, and have every right to be there. It's their property, and they only go by 2 or 3 times a night, and not constantly. But any image that's going when they're going by is done. Next slide. I was startled out of my afternoon daze by Ginny demanding that I take a picture of the mauve sky. So I opened up the window, it was cold outside, and snapped this photo. There was a low bank of thin clouds, and I think the low sun on the opposite horizon lit it up. This was about 2 days before the full moon. No matter what caused it, it sure was unusual to me and beautiful. Next slide. This is my best effort at Oscar's Lunar Challenge. Okay, next slide. On the same day, about 2 hours later, Pamela Weston, a friend of mine, shot this photo of the same mauve sky. She is a fantastic photographer, and her Facebook page is filled with incredible images. You should check it out. Her name is Pamela Weston. Next slide, please. This is one of the challenge objects, a very nice open cluster. Next slide, please. This is another of the challenge objects. Not the open cluster, but the Dark Nebula B226. I don't see it either, actually. I'm sort of interested what Bernard was smoking when he listed this, but next slide. There it is. Next slide. I was fascinated by a long exposure taken with a 34-inch aperture telescope shot of M42, taken by Jim Misty and processed by Robert Gendler. I decided to give it a try, and here is my result. I was out about 6 times in February and took 32 hours of exposures. I then added in 10 hours of exposures from 2019 for a total of about 42 hours. Some of these images were not used because of wind, clouds, snowmobiles, and I used maybe about 30 hours. Now, because I used 30 hours instead of 1 hour, this image is not 30 times better. It doesn't work like that. 1 hour, 2 times better than 1 hour is 4 hours, and 2 times better than that is 16 hours. So 30 hours is maybe a little bit more than 4 times better, but still a nice image. A lot of detail showing there. Not as much as Jim Misty and Robert Gendler got, though. Next image, please. I decided to try the same thing with M51. This is a 20-hour exposure taken over 5 nights in February. Again, a ton of detail shows up, and that I don't get in a 1-hour exposure. Obviously, the lockdown is playing with my common sense, taking these long exposures. They're not that much better than shorter ones. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So next up is Andrea. Just give me a second, Andrea, while I highlight you. And there you are. Okay.
I thought those images were beautiful, Bob, and 20 hours and 30 hours is very impressive. This image is one of the challenge objects from January. It's a little different than the one I think Bob did last month. I brightened it up a little bit. It's a very small, irregular galaxy, IC 1613. And it was setting for me into my house. So I didn't get as much time as I would have liked, but it was quite a really beautiful, beautiful irregular galaxy. And it is apparently in our local group. Next image, please. This is the Pleiades, obviously, and all the nebulosity surrounding the bright stars. This was shot during the full moon, just last week. I was doing some test exposures to fix a problem I had, and this turned out quite nicely, I thought. And I actually got a lot of the brown color in the nebula at the very bottom. So I was quite happy with this. This image, as well as the last image, were taken with the hyperstar lens that I have on my C11 Schmidt-Cassegrain. And it's a very, very fast telescope. So this was maybe two hours of imaging. And I thought it turned out pretty well for a full moon. Next image, please. This was an image that I took with the Red Cat telescope, which is a much smaller little scope, only 250 millimeters, but it has a beautiful flat field right across. And I did about 3 hours of this with a filter, the L-enhanced filter. And I was trying to get more of the red nebulosity along the top of the image. And I got a little bit of it, not as much as I would have liked, but I thought the Horsehead itself and some of the Dark Nebula came out quite well. So I was pleased with that. That was actually the most beautiful night, February 11th. It was crisp, it was clear, it was cold. It was a stunning night. Next image, please. This is the Leo Triplet, which is really a really, really fun target. I had a lot of trouble processing this because I had a light leak in my system. And I kept wondering what this fuzzy thing was that was coming up from the Hamburger Galaxy. And the Hamburger Galaxy is on the left, and you can see there is some kind of little fuzzy stuff coming up the top. Apparently that is a real thing. I thought it was an artifact. I was trying to process it out, but it is the tidal tail of the galaxy. And I noticed if you want to read Sky and Telescope in April, there was a whole article about the tidal tails with the Leo Triplet. M66 is over to the right, the upper right galaxy, and M65 is the lower galaxy. a pretty, they're really pretty. They're very bright, and I think they're a pretty nice target for almost anybody. Next image, please. Next slide. Oh, am I frozen again?
Sorry, no, Andrea, I'm not aware of any additional slides.
Oh, okay. I thought I had one more, but no worries. We'll do it next time.
I left a blank slide in by mistake. You were right.
There it is. Okay, good. This is M78. It's a Messier object in Orion. And in Orion, you will have the Horsehead Nebula to one side, and you would have Barnard's Loop to the other side of this nebula, and there would be red on both sides. I didn't really know this, but when I process this image, there is a little red coming out in the Dark Nebula, and had I done a wider field, you would see a lot more red. But this, I processed this to mainly bring up the blue, and it's a reflection nebula with lots of dark dust, and again, very bright and a really pretty target in Orion. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I'm going to bring up Taras here, just a second. There we go, you're on.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, cool. So this picture is still work in progress, but I'm going to use it as a demonstration from my visual observation report. You know this object very well. It's a Horsehead Nebula in Orion. Andrea just showed a picture of it as well. The bright red glow in this picture originates from ionized hydrogen gas and is caused by nearby bright star Sigma Orionis. The Dark Nebula itself, named Barnard 33, shape of a horse head, is formed mostly by the thick dust blocking the light of stars behind it. This nebula isn't that bright. It was first recorded and discovered by, in 1888 by Scottish astronomer Williamina Fleming on a photographic plate taken at the Harvard College Observatory. The hydrogen glow around the Dark Nebula is quite dim, and it takes a dozen of minutes with a regular telescope and a DSLR camera to expose it so that the shape of a horse can be recognized. This explains why it's been discovered by the photography method. When the longer you're exposed, the dimmer objects can be revealed. I used to think that observing it visually is next to impossible. So when Rick Scholz, director of Fred Lossing Observatory, sent me email with a question about the possibility of observing the nebula visually, I was up for the challenge. My previous attempts to observe it visually through my 8-inch Schmidt CAS with no filters failed. There was nothing in that area where it should have been, even though the nearby Flame Nebula was quite visible. It's a bit brighter though, but I was expecting at least there to be something for Horsehead, but there is practically just nothing. My response to Rick was that perhaps if we use the FLO's 18-inch Star Master with hydrogen alpha filter, then maybe it would be possible to observe it visually. As most of the glow comes from the ionized hydrogen, I thought that hydrogen alpha filter will easily filter out other light frequencies, as possibly the bright glow from the nearby star Alnitak, sky glow, light pollution from Almond, leaving only a red glow of hydrogen alpha spectral line to be seen by our eyes. Next slide, please. And that's what I attempted on January 9th, accompanied by Konstantin Popov and Andrew Brown. We had a set of different eyepieces and filters to try, including 2-inch hydrogen alpha and LE-enhanced narrowband filter, which allows hydrogen alpha, beta, and oxygen 3 frequencies to get through. And it all failed. There was just a hint of nebulosity, or rather slightly brighter than a background patch of something spreading between the stars. But also, it could be just a product of my imagination. Just in case, I made this sketch, which was my first sketch ever made, processed a bit in Photoshop and then inverted. This was observed through 32mm eyepiece with L-enhanced filter. That was what was surprising is that I saw, or at least I believe I did, a faint nebulosity along the row of dimmer stars. I circled them in red here. And it was in the area where seemingly there was not much hydrogen glow actually at all, if you compare it with the actual photographic pictures. I have no explanation to why that area seemed to be a bit brighter, and would attribute it to some side effect of my visual perception. Location where the Horsehead Nebula would be, I circled green in this picture, but if you see, there is nothing distinguishable there. Next slide, please. So I tried different combinations of eyepieces and available filters that night, and there is the summary in this table. The worst results were actually with the use of hydrogen alpha filter. It appears that this filter has very high optical density, such that even Alnitak, the brightest star nearby, which was expected to be blinding and killing our night vision, looked quite dim through that filter. Also, I used to believe that the longer focal length eyepiece is used, the brighter the image should be for our eyes. But that happened to be not exactly the case. The best visual image was actually with 24mm lens. There is an excellent book which Brian McCullough let me read once, Visual Astronomy of the Deep Sky, which explained this phenomenon. To be short, the specifics of our night vision are such that with higher magnification, the contrast between the background and the dim object looks greater to us because of increased detection capabilities of our eyes. Let's go to the next slide, please. So these results were quite disappointing. Not only we were not able to see a dark nebula, but couldn't even agree on the nebulosity, was it there or not? So when I went home and started reading about this object a bit more, I found quite a few cases when the astronomers reported observing the Horse Nebula with their own eyes, and even published some sketches. And apparently this is possible with the use of hydrogen beta filter. So I ordered one. The ionized hydrogen emits not only red light corresponding to 656 nanometer frequency, but also at 486 nanometer frequency, which visually is perceived by us as aqua color. Unlike red, our eyes are more susceptible to this color, and the filter looks optically way less dense as well. So if we use such a filter to observe the regions where hydrogen is glowing, we supposedly will get to see hydrogen beta line emissions, while the rest frequencies will be blocked. That's the theory. Let's go to the next slide. So after the filter arrived, the first opportunity to take a look at the nebula through it was January 31st. This time I used 24mm eyepiece with this filter. The sky transparency wasn't too good, 3 out of 5, I would say. And but I believe I was able to see some of the hydrogen glow, this time in the area where the hydrogen gas was supposed to be. And as for the Dark Nebula itself, at some point I could say there was a soft semicircle shadow there, which I tried to sketch as you see it. But when I asked Konstantin to confirm my observations, he couldn't say with certainty. So we agreed that this would be inconclusive observation and waited for a better opportunity. Let's go to the next slide. So the next opportunity happened to be on February 11th, with when the transparency was much better. This time the nebulosity was clearly seen, stretching almost vertically through the image, especially well noticeable after adapting our eyes to night vision and using the avert vision. The Dark Nebula was seen quite clearly too, although its shape could not be clearly described. It still looked like a semicircular shadow. Konstantin this time was able to confirm it too, and even called it right in your face type of clarity. If scrolling the image through the field by using telescope's buttons, you'd be able to see it drift by slowly and graciously. And it was especially easy to see the entire picture then. with stars, nebulosity, and the shadow moving in front of your eyes. Rick, if you are listening to this, I hope you will have an opportunity to take a look at this nebula before Orion bids farewell for the season. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Taras. So we've got two people on right now. Are you going to do it together, or one first and the other next?
I think we can do it sequentially.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you both in spotlight here. Paul's got his video turned off, so I've got a good picture of Paul there under my name, but it's actually him talking.
Are we good? Dave, are we good?
Yeah, I was talking to my mute button. Sorry. Yeah, we're good. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm presenting my observations this month in conjunction with Jim Thompson, as we've been collaborating on studying the South Polar lunar feature that caught my eye back in December, and that I've discussed in our last two meetings. Jim and I have some interesting developments to share with you tonight on this study. This particular image that I'm showing you isn't related to that feature, but it's just one from a series of high-resolution images that I've been taking as part of my investigations. I particularly like this area for its rugged terrain, which becomes especially prominent when the lunar terminator passes over the region. Janssen is the 191-kilometer diameter, very gnarly-looking complex crater at the upper left. Excuse me. It's located in the moon's southeastern highlands region. So I took this view with my 11-inch Edge HD operating at f/20 with a 2x Barlow and using NextImage 5 camera. I've been using the same configuration for detailed looks at the southern polar region. That's the focus of this report tonight. Next one, please, Chris. So for those of you that have missed the last couple of meetings, just a really brief recap here for context, because I'm going to throw a lot at you here. The feature I'm referring to is the very bright point of light that I imaged on December the 17th. This caught my eye due to its pronounced brightness and noticeable distance from the southern cusp of the lunar terminator. It was quite obvious in binoculars as well, looking almost like a little beacon. Unfortunately, I was only photographing the sky with a 70mm lens that night, as I was concentrating on catching the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And so I didn't get any high-resolution views of the moon. But the Earthshine on the moon that night did provide enough of a look at some of the larger scale features like the mare to help pin down the general area of the feature's location. And so I started investigating. Next one, please, Chris. So I scaled up my image of the moon and matched it to some detailed polar imaging from the Clementine orbiter and topographic data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, oriented to the same view as in oriented to the same date as in my view. This showed a strong correspondence in location to two pronounced mountains, the Malapert Massif and the Leibniz Beta Massif, located very near the moon's south pole. This really fired up my interest, since these are two of the highest mountains on the moon and are being considered as potential landing sites for the upcoming manned Artemis missions, a program that Canada has committed to. If all goes well, we should see at least one Canadian astronaut headed for the moon in the next few years. To me, this definitely made the area an attractive one for high-resolution imaging. Next one, please. So since that initial observation, I've been trying to image the area in high detail when the moon's phase in the sky permitted. My prime suspect for that bright knot of light was the Leibniz Beta Massif. This view was taken when the moon's phase was much fuller than on that night of the initial image back in December. And since the initial surrounding terrain is much more illuminated here, you can see just how rugged this area really is. The scene also reveals that there are numerous high mountain peaks in the vicinity, and so the question is, which one was actually responsible for the bright knot of light? I reasoned that taking a series of images under these more illuminated conditions and on different nights would help me to definitively pin that down once the moon was just, again, barely a barely lit crescent. But these high-resolution views also brought home a factor that made me realize that positive identification of a feature so close to the rim of the moon might be a bit trickier than I first thought. That factor is the effect of the moon's libration. I've discussed this previously, but I thought I could demonstrate it a bit more graphically tonight. Notice the position of the Leibniz Beta mountain in this view from January the 24th. It appears quite close to the rim. Also notice the surrounding terrain is almost fully illuminated. Next one, please. Now, notice in this view, just a week later on February the 1st, the mountain's now apparently tilted more towards us and therefore also away from the rim. This is due to libration, the apparent nodding of the moon as seen from the Earth as it moves around us. It's due to the fact that the moon's orbit is tilted by about 5 degrees with respect to the Earth's orbital plane. Its axis of rotation is also tilted slightly with respect to its own orbital plane. This libration in latitude actually shows up at allows us at various times to see a little bit over the top of the North Pole or over the bottom of the South Pole. Libration also occurs in longitude, due mostly to the fact that the moon's orbit is elliptical. It allows us to see a little further around the eastern or western limbs than we could see otherwise if there was no libration. Notice also the advancing of the lunar terminator on the left side, plunging those features into shadow as night starts to fall there. This also makes identifying specific features on a barely lit crescent moon just a couple of days after its new moon phase rather tricky. So why would these mountains be visible at all when the surrounding terrain is in darkness? The answer lies in their height and the effects of libration. Next one, please. So I showed you some of the libration numbers last month, but I thought a visual demonstration might bring this home more effectively. I assembled this animation from a sequence of daily plots of the moon generated by the Virtual Moon Atlas. It shows just how much the moon's libration causes the apparent wobble in our view from Earth on a day-to-day basis. This sequence covers a 20-day period from the middle of March to the first week in April and then repeats. You can see just how much this wobble might make identifying a specific feature near the limb of the moon less than straightforward. Features can appear and disappear near the rim. And if you look closely, you can also see how a feature's appearance becomes more and more distorted as it nears the rim. This is called foreshortening and turns otherwise circular features into elongated sausages. I hope that's running fairly clearly on your screens, everybody there. It's a bit jumpy on mine, probably due to my limited internet bandwidth out here in the country. Anyway, so next one. Is it smooth? Oh, wonderful, great. Yeah, you can really see the wobbling effect. In fact, I think if you watch this too long, it's starting to make you dizzy. All right, next one, please. All right, so to positively identify lunar features near its south pole, the moon's libration parameters and the effect of foreshortening have to be accurately accounted for. This slide shows just how much foreshortening in particular can affect what we see. The colorful view below is a topographic map showing the terrain elevations around the South Pole, looking directly down on it from above. It covers the region from 80 degrees south latitude down to the pole at 90 degrees south latitude. The brightly lit portion is the area facing the Earth, which was being illuminated by the sun at the time my image above was taken. So as seen from Earth, all that colorful terrain lies in that thin sliver of terrain between the white 80 degrees south latitude line and the moon's rim on my image. Foreshortening really compresses what we're looking at. What my image appears to show us is that the two mountains of interest are on the lunar rim, but the topographic map shows us that they are in fact about 5 degrees away from it. They just appear to be on the rim because of their tremendous heights, almost 7 kilometers for Leibniz Beta, and not much less for the Malapert Massive. And that's the key as to how they can appear to us when the moon is just a slender crescent and their surrounding terrain is in darkness. In this image, notice that the libration in latitude is a mere 14 arc seconds, slightly less than 1/4 of a degree. Back in December, it was over 5 degrees. So in effect, the moon's apparent wobble actually placed those mountains right on the limb from our point of view, allowing much of their full heights to appear against the background sky. With this information in hand, I thought it might be relatively easy to predict when they might again be visible in the same way they were back in December, and thereby positively identify which mountains were putting on the show for us. Next one, please. So the next opportunity to see this looked like it should occur on February the 14th, as I mentioned at last month's meeting. After that meeting, Jim Thompson sent me a number of high-resolution images he'd taken in the past that he thought might help me in my efforts to identify the feature in question. And being an avid and accomplished lunar imager, as you all know, he was also interested in seeing this thing for himself. So we discussed a collaboration to try and image the moon at the appropriate time from each of our locations, and therefore increase our chances that one of us might bag it. 66 kilometers of separation in our locations could mean the difference between a clear and a cloudy sky during the narrow window of time available to get this. As it turned out, February the 14th was a nice sunny day. That is until the critical time between sunset and moonset. Jim got totally socked in, and I did as well, except for a very brief and murky sucker hole that opened up for me shortly before the moon went down. I got this view with a 600mm lens, and although not the greatest, it was enough to show me that the feature was present, but nowhere near as prominent as it was back in December. So even though the libration conditions were very similar, were they varied enough to make such a difference? Was it actually a different physical feature? Or were my calculations just off? We'd need to wait another month for our next shot at determining this. Next one, please. So in the meantime, though, we had started to explore another avenue of this pursuit. I'll show you how we got into this shortly, and then Jim will show you the nitty-gritty of what he's pulled off here, and then some. But suffice to say for the moment that he developed a very neat way to accurately simulate what we should see using the lunar libration and illumination parameters for a given date and time. And by a stroke of good fortune, Andrew Brown sent me a picture of our lunar mystery feature that he had also taken on December the 17th. His image was taken at a focal length of 1000mm compared to my 70mm shot, and so it showed enough detail to accurately compare it with Jim's simulation. The correlation was pretty much bang on. Our mystery beacon of light on the moon was indeed the Leibniz Beta Massive, and its smaller, dimmer neighbor, the Malapert Massive. Thank you again, Andrew, for this valuable catch. It really helped us in all of this. So we now have a tool that we should be able to use to accurately predict when these mountains would be visible as they were back in December, using this date's view as a baseline for comparison, backed up by the real data of Andrew's picture. Next one, please. So after seeing the correlation with Andrew's image was a match, I used Jim's model to compare it to the polar topographic data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to better understand the geometry of what we were seeing. The white line labeled rim in the topographic view shows the edge of the moon's disk near the south polar region that was visible from the Earth. The position of that line is determined by the moon's libration and latitude on that date. You can see that the two mountains are below that line, meaning that they were actually on the back side of the moon from our point of view. Yet there are 2 points of light visible in Jim's model. Next one, please. So we can then show the sunlight falling on the moon and the direction it's coming from. Since the moon was only a very thinly lit crescent seen from Earth on that date, the near side was experiencing mostly night, while most of the far side was experiencing daylight. If you have a closer look at our two mountains of interest, you can see that I've drawn a red ellipse enclosing their eastern flanks. Next one, please. So if we take the sunlight's direction into account, now we see that not only are the Leibniz Beta and Malapert Massives indeed the source of the points of light we saw back in December, but we can tell that it was sunlight being reflected specifically off their eastern flanks that made its way to Earth. And the reason we could see this at all is because even though the bases of these mountains were on the far side, their towering heights allowed them to actually poke up over the lunar rim. And so sunlight streaming in from the backside of the moon was able to bounce off the tops of these peaks and reach our eyes and cameras. Pretty cool stuff. Next one, please. So we've used Jim's model here, coupled with my projections of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter topographic data, to visualize and predict when the next good opportunity this month might be to view this. The best date appears to be March the 15th. On that date, the libration and latitude will be very close to what it was back in December. However, the libration and longitude will be about 5 degrees different, meaning that the sunlight will be hitting the eastern flanks of those mountains at a slightly different angle. The impact of that difference really depends on the precise shape of those eastern slopes up near the tops of those mountains. It could make them appear dimmer, brighter, or not have much of an effect at all. Maybe the December apparition really was a sweet spot in the combination of all the parameters. Hopefully we'll get a chance to find out. We also ran the model for 2 days after the 15th to see the change in geometry. Watch how the lit portion of the terminator grows closer to the mountains and how the rim line moves downwards due to the daily change in latitudinal libration. This brings more of the mountains directly into view over onto the near side. Next one, please. Here we see the situation for March the 16th. The more brightly shaded yellow region between the terminator and the rim lines on the right side of the topographic view indicates the portion of the terrain that's visible from the Earth and is now directly lit by sunlight. It's almost touching the eastern side of the Leibniz Beta Massif. Next one, please. Here on March the 17th, we see that the mountain is now part of the lit cusp of the crescent, but the Malapert Massif should still be seen as separate from the cusp. I'm really hoping for some clear sky to image the moon on each of these nights to find out how well these predictions hold. My fingers are crossed, and we'll see what happens. So, in an alternate reality, I would wind up my observations for the month here and wish you all a good evening. But in this current reality, I want to show you what really and quite unintentionally drew both Jim and myself into a bit of a gravity well of time and effort here and wound up getting us pretty stoked about what we were seeing. Next one, please. Jim blames me for the wear and tear this turn of events has done on his computer and the time he spent on it. In a few minutes, I'll turn things over to him and let him plead his case. But on analyzing the situation, I realized that it was all his fault for sending me this particular image. Either way, this has opened up unexpected pathways for both of us. As I mentioned, Jim sent me a number of his images after last month's meeting to help me try to pin down the lunar feature. But it was this image in particular that caught my attention. What I noticed is, that he had taken this just a day before I took a very similar image of the same region and at pretty much the same resolution. It invited a comparison. Next one, please. Next one, please, Chris. Thank you. So here's Jim's shot taken on January the 31st and mine on February the 1st. I've cropped and oriented them to show the same aspect on both. The shots were taken about 27 hours apart. You can see that the shadows on the left side of mine are a bit darker and more pronounced. This is due to the difference in time, since the terminator advances across the lunar terrain from the left side at about ½ degree per hour. Even though Jim and I both recorded that the seeing was somewhat below average for each of these sessions, it was still good enough to show a lot of detail in the terrain, and we both caught the Leibniz Beta and Malapert Massifs quite nicely. It's when I did this comparison that something struck me about these two views. Way back during my time in university, and also while I was in the forces, I was involved in doing aircraft photo interpretation of terrain features, including stereoscopic viewing. So I got used to seeing the subtle differences between pairs of images that allowed one to see the view in 3D. When I saw our two images here, I wondered if the subtle differences between them, due to the slightly different libration angles and shadowing of those two nights, would allow for a stereo view. There was only one way to find out. Next one, please. So I've recropped and reoriented these two images to place them side by side, and this is the result. So I invite you now to try to resolve this in 3D and check out the view as though you were hovering above the moon. No 3D glasses required. This is similar to the 3D exercise that I showed you last year of the Wolf 359 image taken in conjunction with the New Horizons spacecraft, but this view is much more dimensional. To try this, sit squarely about a meter or so in front of your display and relax, and focus on the black line dividing the two panels, separating the two panels here. Slowly cross your eyes slightly, and you'll notice the text from both sides trying to merge. Try to bring them completely together and into focus. Tilting your head slightly to the left or the right might help you to align them. If you can manage that, the whole view should snap into focus and become very dimensional, with the two mountains becoming quite prominent. You can then look around the image and explore, and explore the crater depths, the valleys, the ridges, and other smaller mountains in the scene. Looking behind the two main mountains, you're looking at the moon's south pole located right at the rim. In this very three-dimensional view, you can get a sense of the moon's curvature towards the limb from your high vantage point. So I'll give you a moment to try this. I see on a couple of the responses there that people are getting this view, so that makes me very happy. So if you can maintain your 3D lock on this, I'm going to flip to the next slide, which is the same image, but without the text. There we go. Here's the view through your spacecraft window. I think the text may make it easier for some folks to resolve the 3D effect, especially for those who have never tried this kind of unassisted cross-eyed stereo viewing before. For others, it may make no difference. So again, here you are hovering above the moon, looking towards the South Pole. So again, try to maintain your 3D lock. And I'm going to flip to the last two images I have for you tonight. I've assembled these from some of the other images that Jim sent me after realizing that this is something that we could actually do. This view is also from the near the moon's south polar region and shows the large flattish crater Bailey near the limb and the elongated crater Schiller at the bottom left. When crossing your eyes, try to bring the limb from both panels together to get focus and to resolve the effect. I find the 3D effect is not as pronounced with this pair, except near the left side where the shadows are noticeably deeper. And again, I'll give you a moment to try to get this one. Pretty cool view. And if you do get it, you'll notice, you'll get a sense for the curvature of the moon as you look towards the limb. Okay, the last one there, please, Chris. All right, so the sharp crater at the center is the relatively young Anaxagoras near the moon's north polar region. Concentrate on trying to bring that crater together to resolve the view. I find this vista to be very three-dimensional, especially when moving from the smooth mare terrain at the bottom into the more rugged highlands terrain as you look towards the limb. The many ridges and sharp features inside the larger craters really stand out. All right, I'm going to bring you back down out of lunar orbit and hope you enjoyed this portion of your flight. I'll ask our friend Mick Wilson to place these images on our website so that you can download or view them from there at your leisure if you were having, especially if you're having any problems resolving here tonight, or if you just want to have another look. Some folks may need to practice this a bit to see the effect. I'd really actually appreciate hearing any feedback on these, since this approach is not something that Jim or I have seen really many examples of done with amateur lunar imagery. So on that note, I'm going to hand off to Jim and let him take you further along on our unexpected journey. Stay safe and clear skies to all. Cheers.
Thank you, Paul. So this past month, as you can see, has been a pretty good example of what could happen when you pull on a loose thread to see where it goes. My collaboration with Paul started very simply with me saying to him, Hey, by the way, I have a large collection of high-resolution lunar images that I've captured over the years. Feel free to use them if they're helpful. That led to the tandem attempt to capture fresh images of the lunar South Pole on February 14th, in the hopes of reproducing Paul's image from December, as was already discussed earlier by Paul. We did not have any idea a month ago that this project would lead us to a new way of visualizing existing lunar image data or to 3D modeling of the lunar surface. Next image, please, Chris. The initial idea to develop a computer model of the lunar South Pole came shortly after our failed attempt on February 14th to capture the desired high-resolution images of the moon. It was clear at that point that the late winter, early spring weather in Ottawa was going to make capturing this imagery very challenging. At the time, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if we could dial in the libration angles and solar position and simulate the view we were trying to capture? Since we are simply trying to determine what lunar feature is producing the bright spots, what does it matter if we use a real image or a simulated one? Well, it so happens that I have some experience with 3D modeling as I use it for visualization and marketing purposes at my work. I also know that there is a lot of data available on the moon online due to the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter website. This was an idea just crazy enough to work. And by the way, the link to this data is at the bottom of the screen. I really encourage you to go check it out. Next slide, please. So shown here are the two main pieces of data I downloaded from the LRO website. A digital elevation model, or DEM, for the lunar South Pole, generated by the Lunar Orbiter Laser Altimeter, affectionately referred to as LOLA, and an image of the lunar surface albedo, in other words, the variation in relative brightness over the surface. If you have not been to the quickmap.lroc website yet, I highly recommend it. There is a long list of sensor data layers that you can put over top of the lunar image, and you can zoom into crazy high spatial resolutions. Both of the data sets I downloaded were saved as monochrome images for use in Caligari TrueSpace, the 3D modeling software that I use. Next image, please. My first attempt at rendering an image of the lunar South Pole used a common technique employed by game developers. The elevation data is applied as a 2D map to the model surface as a bump map, the apparent topography only being resolved in the final rendering of the image. This is exactly the rendering method employed by the software Paul used to generate the libration animation he showed earlier. Initially, this method looked like it was going to give me what I wanted, but a closer look revealed something I was not aware of with regard to the rendering of bump maps. The rendering of the bumps does not extend past the extent of the underlying object geometry. Thus, where there were supposed to be mountains and valleys visible along the moon's edge, in my rendered image, there was only a smooth edge marking the end of the object's physical geometry. Darn. A good try, but it looked like I needed to go to the next level and model the actual lunar surface. Next image, please. After some hunting around on the internet, I found a software called AccuTrans 3D that is able to convert DEM data into a 3D surface. The free trial version I downloaded worked very well, easily importing the image of LOLA DEM data and converting it into a surface mesh that I could then import into TrueSpace. I had to keep an eye on the size of the resulting model, though, as very quickly the software can produce a mesh with millions and millions of surfaces. I settled on a model in the 500,000 surface range in order to be able to manage rendering it on my desktop computer. Next image, please. The surface mesh produced by Accutrans 3D was planar shaped. It was flat. So the first thing I had to do after importing it into TrueSpace and scaling it properly was to give it curvature to match with the curvature of the moon. The section of moon included in my model covers the bottom 30 degrees of latitude, which is about 1,700 kilometers across in full scale. Once the surface mesh was ready, I just had to add infinite lights for the sun and earth shine and position my camera. This time, the rendered images very clearly showed topography along the moon's edge. Success. With a working model of the lunar South Pole, I was then able to generate a simulated image for any combination of solar position and lunar libration that Paul wanted. Some of my resulting renders were already presented by Paul earlier this evening. Now having the capability to render realistic views of the moon, another thought occurred to me. What about 3D images? Next image, please. It seemed reasonable that the method applied by Paul to turn real lunar images from successive nights into a combined 3D image could be applied to rendered images as well. The main difference being that instead of using rendered images of the moon on 2 different nights and using the change in libration angles to give the illusion of 3D, I instead chose to use 2 cameras spaced some distance apart to generate views on the same night. This is essentially how humans can see in 3D using our 2 eyes. I found that the technique worked, with the distance between the cameras defining the apparent depth of field in the resulting 3D image. My final 3 slides are some examples of what I was able to produce. Next image, please. The first image is of the area of interest in Paul's investigation of crescent moon bright spots. This view is what you would see from 10 degrees below the moon's orbital plane, looking up at the lunar South Pole during a full moon. Just like Paul described earlier, to see the 3D effect, you simply force your eyes to cross until the 2 images merge into a 3rd image in the middle. I find this image allows me to very clearly visualize the size and shape of the Leibniz mountain chain. I'll give you all a few moments to try this. So looking straight ahead at the black line that separates the 2 images, just gently cross your eyes until a 3rd image forms in the middle. And I find the red lettering helps your eyes to kind of lock in. So if it works for you, you can really see the apparent size and position of all the mountains in the Leibniz mountain chain. And as Paul mentioned, we'll give these to put in the monthly newsletter, so you can all try this on your own at home. Next slide, please. The next image is of one of my favorite lunar features, the Hadley Reel. It is the location of the Apollo 5 mission. This image gives one an idea of what it must have been like for the astronauts to be walking around on the moon's surface at the foot of the imposing Mount Hadley, which is sort of in the background on the left side. The image is not as smooth as the previous one due to the scale of this model. This is a completely different model from the South Pole model. The distance from the camera to Mount Hadley in this image is about 100 kilometers. The resulting spatial resolution of the model is showing the limits of the Lola-Dem data. I'll give you a few minutes to try to lock in. Again, the red text might help you to lock in on the 3D effect. And finally, my last image is in fact a video. I'll let you all kind of lock your eyes in before Chris presses play. Okay, I guess you can go ahead, Chris. This shows the appearance of the lunar south pole. Looks like the video's not starting. Oh, there we go. So the lunar south pole observed from 20 degrees below over the course of a lunar month. The animation begins with the full moon and cycles through last quarter, new moon, first quarter, and then back to full moon. This animation took about 55 minutes to render for each of the two views. So it was almost 2 hours of computer time on an 8-core machine to render it. An interesting thing to note is that the Leibniz Mountains, for the most part in this animation, remained illuminated at their very tops over the entire lunar month. That is one of the reasons why they have been identified as a good place to build a permanent lunar base. One can have uninterrupted solar power there all month. Another reason is that there are a number of craters very close by that are permanently in shadow. And you can see that in the animation as well. And that scientists have detected water ice in those craters. The water in those craters will be an important resource for any future inhabitants of the moon. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening and watching. I have to say this has been a fun month for me, following this project to where it has led us. My thanks to Paul for providing the spark that lit this fire. Thank you.
I guess you're not mad at me anymore for all the computer time, eh, Jim?
No. It helps keeps the house warm running it at 100%.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you very much, folks. Whoops, there we go. Bring my picture back on, and let me just clean up my virtual background here. There we go. That's better. Okay, that was fascinating. So thanks to Oscar, we have our observing challenge. Last month we had M38, B226, Simi's 147, and Crater Cleomedes. And for this month, we have NGC 2392, Planetary Nebula in Gemini. It's also known as the Clown-Faced Nebula. And so that is our beginner challenge for this month. Intermediate challenge is NGC 2440, Planetary Nebula in Puppis. And our advanced challenge is Palomar 1, Globular Cluster in Cephus. And our lunar challenge is Frau Maro, and remains of a walled plain whose center is intersected by longitudinal clefts east of Mare Insularum and Mare Cognitum. So those are our challenges for this upcoming month. There's a summary of them. These will be in our Astronauts newsletter as well. Fred Lawson Observatory is open. Right now it's a limit of 5 people on site outdoors. Best way to coordinate this is to flip an email to the group and say, hey, I'm going out. And it's worked out quite well in the last little bit. So we just have to limit the number of people out there right now during COVID times. Fortunately, the museum and library are closed, so we do not have access to our Stanmont book library. At some point, we'll be able to get there. Here are the folks that keep our club running, so thank you to them. Thank you. We had 108 at any one point in time on our presentations here tonight, and thank you to all the organizers and speakers, and to the RASC National Office for allowing us to use their Zoom account. Any comments or ideas, please send them to me, meetingchair@ottawa.rasc.ca. I'm always looking for ideas for speakers, and it doesn't have to be somebody outside of our group. We have some amazing speakers within our own group. So if you have something you'd like to share, maybe you've built your own unique observatory or your own unique piece of equipment, please flip me an email and I can schedule you in. Okay, next slide, please. So if you'd like to join the RASC, regular membership is $88. Family membership is $82.50, $15 an adult, $8.10 per youth. That's a really good deal. Youth membership is $53 for those under 21 years old or under 25 if a student. So what do you get for your membership? Well, you have access to the Ted Bean Telescope Loan Library. When the museum reopens, you'll have access to the Stan Mott Book Library. We have our Fred Lossing Observatory out near Almont, and members are welcome to use that facility as well. In addition to that, you get a subscription to Sky News. It comes out every 2 months. It's owned by the RASC now. A monthly issue of the RASC Journal, and you do have the option for a little bit more of getting a hard copy of that. Every year around Christmas time, you'll get the Observer's Handbook for the following year, an excellent resource. And then we have our own local amazing astronauts. Our editor, Gordon Webster, publishes articles from members, and as well as images and things for our meetings as well. Our next meeting is going to be 1 week later because of April 2nd, the Good Friday is the first Friday in April. So we're moving our meeting out 1 week to April 9th. We're still going to be meeting virtually, and probably will be meeting virtually, I would expect, probably until the end of this year. We maybe December we'll be able to get back in, but we have to wait to see where all the inoculations have gone and where COVID is at. But at this stage, we're going to continue to meet virtually. And I think that is it, Chris. Is that right? Yep. So thank you very much, folks, for coming out. We're finished in good time tonight. So while we can't meet together to go have a beer, you now have an opportunity to have one before you go to bed, or whatever your taste is. So thank you, folks, and we will see you next month on April the 9th. Stay safe. Clear skies.